Hello, welcome to an episode of Wing Zero-Duality. And on this episode, we're going to ask ourselves, what does success mean in the age of AI? Can success be redefined? Is it going to have to be redefined? And I guess where we can begin is by doing something that I normally wouldn't do, which is try to relate to an audience in an individuated and separated manner. Meaning that there's a separation between the listener or the viewer and the speaker. All right. And so that approach is an approach which brings much success to YouTubers who are relatively in the same position that I am, which is one that includes a very minimal setup, minimal audio setup, minimal video setup, maybe a park setting, maybe a car setting, something like that. And I watch YouTube a lot, and these YouTubers will go ahead and delve into their experience so that the audience can relate. And now, mind you, that approach is one which I don't take because it would cheapen the point that is trying to be made. The point that is trying to be made is that we, as people, may have to really ask ourselves whether the assumptions that we make about ourselves, each other, and the world can be open to being lived without. All right? And so that kind of approach doesn't have a set or fixed point, but that's where most people are at. Most people are at looking to find someone who will bring them a fixed point, a fixed conclusion, a fixed answer. Someone who has lived through something or is an expert at whatever it may be. Except we're entering into the age of AI where knowledge, memory, and experience is revealing itself for what it is, which is a mechanical, conditioned, let's say, quality. So I don't want to cheapen the quality of these inquiries together. Now, for success purposes, I suppose I return to that having to be part of the equation. That a viewer would want to know something from someone who knows. That most people's daily lives are set upon this approach, which is searching, looking, depending on. Who knows? Who knows the truth? As well as reinforcing psychological authority, okay, through the mind's chatter, through the image-making process, okay. So I'll give you an example of just recently how one of the things I've had to accept is that this question of redefining success is one that will be hard-earned. This question is one which will not be asked by the vast majority of people because it questions the foundations of how we see ourselves, each other, and the world. And most people aren't ready to make that leap for themselves. They may be entertained by it. They may categorize it in some shape or form. But such a question has no boundaries. Such a question leaves oneself on a pathless path. All right. So I'll give you this example. Recently, I've had to really ask myself where things are going in terms of this sort of material. Because remember, this sort of material is so radically different that my day-to-day life does not consist of being able to really get down to these questions and then apply them in terms of succeeding in creating for a structure of society that resolves for certain conflicts. No, that's not what my day-to-day life consists of, no. However, I've had some experiences where maybe a closely related question or, dealing in fundamental change, for example, in the world of recovery. And now, when the word recovery appears to someone has to depend on their knowledge, memory, and experience of what recovery is referring to. Is it referring to addiction? Addiction to what? And so on and so on. However, we've come to a point where the notion of recovery has, because of the inability for experts to resolve for this conflict on a, let's say, mass scale, that the notion of recovery has become somewhat open-ended. Recovery may not really mean sobriety. Recovery may not really mean even support amongst one another. Recovery may not necessarily mean anything that has been handed down from generation to generation. The disease model, right, for example, that there's an inherent disease in some people and some people there are not. And all of these are the bases and foundations for where to begin in terms of approaching this issue. However, the question that has not appeared is the question of whether the psychological self itself is really only a construct, that there isn't a self there to be addicted. That's a very sensitive question. I mean, framing it like that just scratches the surface, but I spent a few months looking to inquire together about this sort of material, and I found that perhaps it's somewhat entertaining, somewhat interesting, I guess. But the question is, can people see that I'm very serious about that question? That it's possible for any one person to be serious enough as to that question? So what I did was I went ahead and had this material sort of outlined, and then I provided an example of which would beg those two questions, which is whether I'm someone who's serious about this sort of material, and whether that material can be applied to resolve for the specific problem. And I was hoping that it would be the case, but what I found was that for the most part, people are still looking through their conditioned lens, cultural conditioning as to how we relate to one another, definitions, meanings, assignments of roles as to communication. And whether this material can resolve for that conflict is one which, although for a great deal of time this material and myself would be correlated in terms of why we relate to one another, or what it is that I have to offer, quickly does the conditioning come into play. Quickly, mechanically, systematically, does such issues, especially of a very sensitive nature, and recovering addiction certainly is of a sensitive nature, because one can imagine if you've believed in a disease model for your whole life and someone comes along and says, wait a minute, that's where in science is that set? It's going to get very sensitive, amongst other things. I mean, even if the disease model is not one's own particular foundation for how they resolve for the relationship with themselves, each other, and the world, identity may be that approach. And even then, questioning identity as if there's a separation between the identity, the identified, and the identified, right? Separation between the two. Anyway, long story short, redefining success in AI, in the age of AI, we'll have to go ahead and, as I am more confident than ever, ask these questions of which most people would be like, well, what the heck are you talking about? What is this guy talking about, man? What is this guy talking about? I don't understand what you're talking about. And so I'm going to return to my conditioning, because that's the safe place, see? And so that's the vast majority of people. As well as the factoring in of one's daily life in terms of earning money, all right? So those are the two considerations. On a personal level, what one's belief system is, what one's belief structure is, one's own knowledge, memory, experience, whatever's reasserted to oneself. On a personal level, that's something that can't be shaken. All right? So you can see that all we have to do is turn on the news and see that the vast majority of people are trying to shake up each other's conditioning through conditioning. Whether it's the Republicans and the Democrats, right? Whether it's the religious and the non-religious. Whether it's all sorts of manners of which society's structure is built upon separation. Such conflict will permeate in the age of the internet, and then even more so in the age of AI. Such conditioning is going to have to be questioned if we are to resolve for conflict on a mass scale. And so, I had another instance. It was one which included a, let's say, community of which peace is sort of the emphasis, peace and harmony. Except it's peace and harmony found through a political lens. That there's a political lens of which brings peace and harmony. And anything outside of this political lens then must be something that is not of peace and not of harmony. And we're at a point where, especially because of the internet, we can group together in separation, in conditioned lens. And to question whether there's peace and harmony, freedom from the political ideology, is something that is not going to happen anytime soon for most people. No. On a day-to-day basis, that's where we're at in this world. But anyway, I do feel more confident than ever that we're going to have to ask ourselves whether there's a fundamentally different way of living. But more practically, what I'm going to have to do is find an industry where such a question comes to a fold. And it's not psychology. Psychology is not that field. You would think if we're talking about a fundamentally different way of living, on a day-to-day basis within psychology play the role that is most fitting. And we're coming to find that eventually most people will turn to a computer to talk about themselves, right? Because the human being, it's either one of two things. It's either the human being chooses what ideological perspective or know-how best suits what they believe, right? And or that the sense of being judged, right? Being stigmatized plays a role. So the computer eventually, probably in the next decade or so, will be able to conversate and analyze and work within thought's limitations. Because that's where most people are at. Most people are looking to resolve for the limitation of thought through another limited fragment of knowledge, memory, and experience. But rather, the space industry could be that industry. Because it's certainly an industry that's growing and it's going to need more people in it to really expand upon it. And, certainly there's many questions that are still left up to humans as to how the space industry will begin to correlate with other industries, seemingly industries that may be unrelated, but that will certainly have a connection. And as well as that, the space industry probably one of the more forward-thinking industries in terms of applying automation to many of its aspects. So a job, in that sense, is one which could be readily secured in many different facets of whatever my professional acumen is. And as well as being able to utilize the tool of blockchain technology to go ahead and be able to interconnect and interdepend in a fundamentally different manner. So you see how it goes back to this material which we inquired together about these questions. But as well as that, all things considered, the large question which remains unresolved is the notion of whether conditioning in a sense of a national identity sense or whatever sense is going to be one which is going to be useful at all in the space age. And I pointed up in terms of distance. In terms of what distance does the conflict that arises from identifying with thought, the living, breathing human being that loses its, the individual loses its value, its indivisible quality, when the system becomes more of an importance. And that's why this channel here is not one which I could deliver content a little bit more to attract audiences, right? Using a script, remembering to tell audiences to like and subscribe, or having more of a entertaining, eye-grabbing approach to this material. But no, this material is specifically designed for whomever it is that is serious enough, right? Because they have to go really out of their way to get to the point where they're asking such questions. As you can turn on YouTube and you can see how ingrained the notion of a fixed observer is to begin, right? Because a lot of what the analysis that takes place in terms of resolving for conflicts begins with that premise. To get to the point where that premise is questioned for oneself, not theoretically, not in entertainment, because that's what most people are looking for, entertainment. Their politics is entertainment. Their spiritual gatherings are entertainment. Their entertainment is entertainment. You see, but this is not in the realm of entertainment. So that's about it. Redefining success in the age of AI is going to be hard earned. And being able to meet the future in the now will be what, ironically, right, because most people do not see the value in such a fundamentally different way of living. Ironically, it could be what could create for a fundamentally different trajectory. Hey, how's it going? Welcome to an episode of Wing Zero-Duality. And on this episode, we ask ourselves whether AI is a mirror that we may be afraid of looking into. And we're not asking whether AI is good or bad. We're not asking whether AI art is true art or fake art. We're not asking whether AI is a money-making tool by corporate entities. We're not asking whether AI is sophisticated or not. We're not asking whether AI is going to change the world. What we're asking is whether AI is a mirror that the human being, the living, breathing human being, may be afraid to look into. And we ask ourselves this because we can see for ourselves that AI is a great topic of debate, a topic which is relegated to the realm of opinion, somewhat dominated by the voices of the experts, and is being experimented with in ways that are creating questions that have never arisen before for this species. And who is this species? It's oneself. So we begin not with the precipice of knowledge, the precipice of expertise, the precipice of being someone from a vantage point so high up in society's ladder. But rather we ask ourselves as an ordinary human being who lives on a day-to-day basis, then what we have in common is simply the question of what is thought? What is thought and why do we think? Not whether someone's thought is so profound, not whether someone's thought is so well informed, not whether someone's thought is of a particular nature that aligns with our belief system, with our opinion, with what we know, with what we care for. But rather we ask what is thought and why do we think? Is there thought that is not bound to the past? Certainly thought can conjure up a future, as in tomorrow at this time I will be awakening to go to work, or later I will have this for dinner. Certainly that is going to be part of the future, but it is still bound by the past. Where is the restaurant? Where is the job location? How will one get there, right? It's all that is bound to the past. And it appears that the human being is fitted with the capacity to gather knowledge, memory, and experience, apply it, meaning being able to analyze it, compare, contrast, right? As elementary school kids, our assignments were to utilize the technique of comparing and contrasting, and then be able to skillfully present knowledge, memory, and experience, provide knowledge, memory, and experience. And it appears that the computer is doing the same. The computer, which is fitted with the capacity to gather knowledge, memory, and experience, apply it, and send it. Okay? And yet, what is originality? Because that could be the fear of which then settles in to the human being who has always been at the forefront of all that is to be known, to be experienced. Is originality a mixture of the past? Creative writing, creative drawing, creative any kind of endeavor that involves drawing from knowledge, memory, and experience, applying it, and sending it. So we've asked ourselves whether AI is a mirror of which the human being may have fear and looking into. And we'll get to what is fear. But let's recap the questions. Is AI a mirror of which looking into may provide fear? What is thought and why do we think? Which is a useful tool, is it not, to gather what one wants between this and that, between here and there, between then and now. And then we asked ourselves, what is originality? So originality could be combined with the question of what is fear, in the form of what is the origin of fear. And fear is a common human experience. Fear requires two elements. Fear requires knowledge, and fear requires time. And so when one is in a state of fear, one knows of something to be fearful of, right? And in time, such fear will come to an accord. Such is fear, is it not? And so, when the human being is confronted with a mirror, shaped by its very own knowledge, memory, and experience, because that's what AI is shaped by, its contours, its boundaries, what it is, what it knows, what it says, why it says it, is shaped by the entirety of the symbolic representation of thought that is found on the internet. And so when the human being comes to find itself, meet itself, right? Because the human being meets itself through AI, not because of the physical property of having a body, or even experiencing an emotion such as fear, but because the human being, is it not, a memory, a thought. A observer watches this video and can have a memory of the speaker. And all that has been known and experienced in terms of who the speaker has met and why is contained in memory, an image. And so ultimately all one is, in terms of oneself as a psychological self, is memory. So this mirror, which reflects back how conditioned the human being can be, how bound to the limitations of thought the human being can be, what sort of action resolves for this fear? Because if we look on the internet, we can see the fear rising, culminating, splintering, fracturing, right? opinions, beliefs. What do you know? What do I know? What do they know? What do we know? And so on and so on. Carving out separation amongst entities of which typically would gather together to observe a piece of visual art or listen to a music soundtrack, and so on and so on. These actions have been relegated to the past, to fragments of memory which are static, which are images that are not the action of which brings about the ending of fear. Is it possible to look in this mirror and have the mirror dissolve for itself? This reflection of which is in constant conflict with one's day-to-day life. Because then, perhaps, originality could come about. Not the mixture of the past in a way that's never been mixed before. No, not that. But rather the action of time and space evolving, growing, changing, moving, exploding, as oftentimes the origin of the universe is described at, although an explosion out of nowhere into nothing. So it's not quite an explosion. Something that thought cannot conjure, something that thought cannot touch, a quality of which is beyond time itself. So, whether AI is a mirror that the human has fear looking into, is a question that only one can ask and resolve for oneself.